She angrily made a sign language gesture at the president's spokesperson in the news. The woman, named Jade, worked as a sign language interpreter anchor at the TV station. That day, due to a delay issue, the screen froze on an inappropriate gesture. The station's leadership, upon noticing this, immediately have interrupt the broadcast with other news. It so happened that the station had just received a notice. After 5 minutes, President spokesperson Park would respond to the terrorist hostage situation. Thus, they decided to switch to broadcasting that news. At the same time, Lee comforted Jade, telling her not to take it to heart, that the gesture meant mountain in sign language. So it was those shouting and making a fuss who were truly unreasonable. At that moment, a staff member came to inform Jade that her part of the work was complete, and she could leave the studio. Just as she was about to step out the door, the press conference began. Park, on behalf of South Korea, officially announced that regarding the high ransom and troop ball demanded by the terrorists, if their demands were not met, they would kill the hostages. The South would not negotiate. This was no different from openly provoking the terrorists. Jade had initially intended to leave, but she couldn't resist turning back and making a mountain gesture. In fact, after finishing the public statement, Park turned off the microphone and suggested imposing temporary control over the media present. The earlier statement was meant for the outside world to hear. In reality, it was out of concern that these people might misinformation and disrupt public confidence. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs already had a rescue plan in place. That afternoon, Jade's future mother-in-law demanded that she resign from her job. After all, the election campaign was set to begin a month, and it was time for her to learn how to be a supportive wife. Jade's mother, standing nearby, immediately chimed in, only to be met with disdain from the other woman. The future mother-in-law kept nagging, saying that her future daughter-in-law, just like her name, was not suited to be in the public eye. That night, Jade didn't know where to go and drove aimlessly along the roads. Suddenly, the radio started emitting a constant, chaotic noises, and soon after, the GPS lost its signal. Before she could process what was happening, the car abruptly began accelerating uncontrollably. At that moment, Jade realized it was too late to step on the brakes. Meanwhile, a mysterious figure was closely monitoring her. As the car's speed increased, it became completely beyond Jade's control. Just as she was about to rear in the car in front, she sharply turned the wheel all the way to the left, finally coming to a stop at an intersection. However, before she could catch her breath, Jade discovered that no matter how hard she pulled, the door handle wouldn't budge. At the same time, the radio kept repeating the morning's news. Suddenly, she recalled a past report about an incident. A driverless car's windows would suddenly roll down, and the door handles would open on their own. Usually, this was the work of hackers using malicious software to take over the vehicle. At that moment, the mysterious figure appeared not far away, slowly approaching the car. Suddenly, the car door clicked after. Park received an anonymous phone call, the caller threatening to kill his wife. As luck would have it, Park's phone battery died at that exact moment. During the pause, asked a colleague to trace the kidnapper's number. Once the phone powered back on, the threatening call came through again. But unexpectedly, Park asked the kidnapper if had yet. He added that he was far too busy today to deal with pranks. Just as he was about to hang up, the kidnapper claimed they'd a knife to his wife's throat, warning that they would act if he hung up again. Park, having dealt with countless similar calls before, firmly stated he wouldn't pay a single cent of ransom. Unbeknownst to him, the kidnapper had put the call on speaker, and the hostage, Jade, heard everything clearly from inside the car. After pap up once more, the kidnapper grew increasingly furious, their emotions spiraling out of control. Still, they refrained from killing Jade before getting the ransom, insisting repeatedly that this was no joke. Park, however, dismissed it as another prank, even encouraging them to go ahead with it. This made Jade wonder if Park had more than one wife. Though the words were casual, they struck a chord with Jade. Park's attitude planted a seed of doubt in her mind. Time ticked by second, and the kidnapper's calls went unanswered. This drove him into a frenzy, pulling out a fury and furiously stabbing the headrest of the driver's seat. In the process, his hand slipped, accidentally cutting Jade's neck. After being subjected to prolonged threats and harm, cheer reached its peak. At that moment, the kidnapper began bragging about his phone, claiming that whenever he called Park, a voice changer would activate automatically. Additionally, it was protected by a VPN system that couldn't be traced for 10 minutes. Suddenly, the call connected. It turned out and accidentally answered it. Park immediately warned the kidnapper not to call again, telling him that if he planned to kill his wife, he should just get her over with. Moreover, Park added, "Contact me once she's a corpse," before hanging up once more. Hearing this, the kidnapper snapped, smashing the car in a fit of rage. In stark contrast, Jade appeared unusually calm. Her husband's words echoed in her mind over and over, filling her with an overwhelming sense of despair. Without hesitation, she slammed her foot down on the accelerator. Meanwhile, Park needed to handle the operation to rescue the hostages. He left his phone in the office, and no one knew ill afterward. It wasn't until nighttime, when Pak returned home, that he saw Jade standing there unharmed. This further confirmed his belief that the earlier situation was just another prank like before. With a hint of indifference, he casually remarked, "Oh, you're still alive." This completely crushed Jade, who already felt undervalued in the marriage. It turned out that 3 years ago, on the day of their wedding, Pak had made it clear that Jade was merely a stand-in bride. To avoid public attention, the wedding was conducted privately, and Pak explicitly stated that he would not need her to fulfill the role of a wife in front of the public. Moreover, Pak had Jade sign an agreement with 3 conditions. First, the bride was not allowed to initiate divorce. Second, divorce was forbidden during the election period. Third, most importantly, as Pak's wife, Jade was prohibited from revealing her name or appearance to the public. If she violated any of these conditions, she would be required to pay a penalty of 2 billion won. Although Jade was deeply unwilling, she still signed the agreement. Afterward, Pak knelt on one knee and placed a wedding ring on her finger. Over the past 3 years, Pak's wife's identity had remained undisclosed, and Jade lived an unhappy life. The next day, the British ambassador hosted a banquet. Because his wife had a hearing impairment, Pak brought Jade along for the first time to serve as a sign language interpreter. However, Pak couldn't understand sign language at all, so he had no idea what Jade and the ambassador's wife were talking about. To avoid breaching their agreement, Jade refused to acknowledge her marital relationship with Pak. This shocked the British ambassador, as their intimate interactions earlier had led most people to believe they were a couple. Pak explained that he was the president's scapegoat, often subjected to personal attacks. His wife was his greatest vulnerability, so he didn't want his family exposed to such an environment. It was clear that Jade was dissatisfied with this response. During the break, she drank heavily, and under the influence, she told her husband through sign language. Although she couldn't speak, she could hear just fine. She dismissed the excuse of hiding her identity to protect her. By now, she was already scarred inside and out. Pak, unable to understand her signing, felt like he was being scolded. Jade, fed up with arguing with someone like him, turned to leave. But after taking a few steps, she couldn't suppress her anger. She began to wonder if the kidnapper was right. Perhaps Pak truly had another wife. With that, she left the banquet altogether. Not long after, Pak received a call from the kidnapper. The caller not only knew he was attending the British ambassador's banquet, but also accurately pointed out that Pak hadn't eaten a single thing that night. This meant the person could very well be in the crowd. Pak immediately felt uneasy. He suddenly noticed a figure making a call on the second floor, disappearing in a flash. He quickly gave chase, navigating several twists and turns until he finally cornered the mysterious person in the restroom. It became evident this individual was not the kidnapper. Pak attempted to provoke the person, stalling for time so that his colleague could trace the exact location of the call. However, what came next shook him to his core. The voice on the other end revealed a shocking truth. Pak was originally supposed to marry Yan, the eldest daughter of the Sky News family. But Yan ran away the day before the wedding. Because a union between the Pak family and the Jade family was critical, Pak had no choice but to marry Yan's younger sister, Jade. Hearing this, Pak's tone softened. He cautiously asked the caller what they wanted. What Pak never expected was this: the kidnapper demanded he divorce Jake in twist. The caller was Jade herself. It turns out that after Pak hung up the phone for the second time that night, Jade's emotions completely erupted. She couldn't believe her husband, that bastard, could treat her this way. So, she ordered the kidnapper to call again, demanding answers. Since Pak didn't have the phone, it went unanswered, which left Jade heartbroken and resigned. In despair, she floored the gas pedal, intending to end it all with the kidnapper. However, Jade buckled her seatbelt, suffering only minor scratches. On the other hand, the kidnapper, knocked unconscious by the impact, lay motionless. Jade seized the opportunity to grab the special phone. With less than 2.5 minutes before the tracking began, she urgently demanded Pak pay the 2 billion Korean won ransom before the deadline the next day. To her surprise, Pak Chuk owned hearing this. He'd encountered many ransom-seeking kidnappers, but this was the first time one had made him feel tense. Jade, using the kidnapper's tone, threatened Pak with divorce. As pictally, this piqued Pak's curiosity. After hanging up the phone, the two happened to meet at the bathroom door. Pak then took Jade to an empty room, asking her if she had been in a car accident the previous night. After a long silence with no response, he took matters into his own hands, beginning an examination. Jade was confused by this sudden turn of events. Before Shikri, her clothes were already being undone. Although they were a married couple by name, there was still a sense of modesty. At that moment, Pak discovered a clear wound on his wife's neck, confirming that the kidnapping had indeed happened the previous night. Furious, he scolded Jade for not telling him, and then asked if she had seen the kidnapper's face. Jade admitted that the kidnapper wore a mask, so she couldn't see his face clearly. Pak immediately rushed outside, asking Zags if they had tracked the kidnapper. Since the call lasted less than 10 minutes, they couldn't track the location. So, he asked his subordinates to investigate the vest of everyone who attended the party, as well as the list of staff members. He would send the recording over shortly, urging them to analyze it as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, Jade listened to the recording of Pak's anxious tone and couldn't help but smile. She was quite pleased with herself for being able to get under that arrogant guy's skin. However, there was one thing that worried her. She had held on to the kidnapper's phone for 2 days now, and she knew the bad guys would soon be frantically searching for it. Just then, Pak suddenly burst into the bedroom, demanding Jade's car keys. Jade couldn't understand why Pak needed the keys, but then he must have realized what had happened. She quickly ran downstairs, remembering that when the second phone call was hung up in despair last night, she had yelled out loud. That moment might have been captured by the car's dash cam. When she rushed to the parking garage, Pak had already checked the car. He looked extremely angry, not understanding how the could have crashed so badly and still been driven back. With a lingering sense of fear, Jade admitted that she had called a tow truck. Suddenly, Pak shifted his tone, mentioning the dash cam footage. All the images from the incident were gone. Upon hearing this, Jade let out a sigh of relief. In the end, the matter was left unresolved. The next day, Pak arranged to have a meal with his mother to inquire about who knew about Jade's role as a proxy bride. Pak's mother revealed that, apart from the two families and the individuals involved, only Yan, the one who ran away, knew about it. This meant that the person responsible for the kidnapping could be someone familiar with the situation. At the same time, to Jade's safety, Pak assigned a bodyguard to her. The bodyguard was called away to help with an issue at Jade's workplace, and as soon as he left, someone appeared at the restroom door. Jade had just finished when she suddenly heard hurried footsteps outside the restroom. She glanced out and saw a strange figure, which instantly reminded her of the mysterious person from that night. Sure enough, when the bodyguard returned to dealing with the situation, he found Jade was nowhere to be found. However, Jade hadn't disappeared. She had simply bumped into a college senior she hadn't seen in 3 years. When the bodyguard sent a picture of Jade and her senior chatting happily, Pak felt a pang of jealousy. His emotions flared up further when his subordinate described the senior as handsome and svelte. Pak became furious, so much so that he couldn't focus on his work. Meanwhile, after exchanging numbers with her senior, Jade hurried back home. As soon as Jade entered the house, her mother barged in right behind her, carrying 2 large boxes and commanding Jade into what was inside. Curious, Jade opened the boxes and was shocked to find extremely revealing lingerie inside. Her mother sternly reminded her that Jade had agreed to this proxy marriage in order to secure her father's comfortable nursing home. But the condition was that Jade maintain her role as Pak's wife and keep the marriage with the Pak family intact. If Jade didn't bother, her father, who was suffering from dementia, could be left on the streets. In short, Jade's leverage was her father's vulnerable condition. Reluctantly, Jade had note but to obey her mother's orders. Even though she didn't want to, her mother also noticed a red birthmark on her leg, which became an important detail in the story. However, Jade had been quietly plotting her escape from her mother's control. She pulled out the untraceable phone and Pak at the exact time she had planned. Meanwhile, Pak, who had previously consulted his mother, a psychologist, on how to handle negotiations, knew that the more forceful side typically prevailed. He had also learned that trust had to be built, or there would be no hope of success. When Jade's call came through, Pak did not answer immediately. Instead, he waited for a while before picking up. Jade, in the tone of a kidnapper, demanded to know whether Pak had made a decision. Either pay the 20 billion Korean won ransom or allow his wife to die. Surprisingly, skillfully diverted the conversation. He brought up something that had been bothering him. From all the external information, it seemed Yan should have been his wife. Yet the kidnapper knew personal details that only family members would know. Jade's sudden change in tone caught Pak off guard for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. He warned the kidnapper to one who had hurt his wife, especially someone responsible for the car crash, would get any sympathy or compromise from him. However, Jade was well prepared for this response. She sent over a close-up photo, threatening to reveal it to Pak. The photo clearly showed a birthmark on her thigh, a mark that only someone close to her would recognize. She emphasized that Pak should recognize this and not deny who the woman in the photo was. Pak, after seeing the photo, let a lot in. Testing the waters, asked the kidnapper if they were married. Jade casually responded that she was married but was now single, which immediately triggered a response from Pak. He seized on this weakness. Now certain that this was no ordinary situation, Pak, annoyed by the kidnapper's behavior, declared that no one knew Jade better than him, and if the kidnapper was trying to intimidate him, they should have done their homework. Jade, initially satisfied with her threat, soon regretted letting the kidnapper get such a personal confirmation. But then, her frustration set in. After all, the photo she had sent was carefully taken, with the angle specifically chosen to capture the birthmark. How dare the kidnapper dismiss it as an internet image, claiming to know Jade better than anyone. It stung that her careful planning had been so easily underestimated. As night fell, Jade once again found herself caught in a wave of tension. She heard her husband's footsteps approaching and pulled the blanket over her head, terrified that he might really try to verify the birthmark. Her heart raced as his footsteps grew louder, almost pounding in her chest. For the first time, Pac didn't immediately pull the blanket off. Instead, he tried to tug it again, but Jade clung to it tightly. They were locked to a quiet tug of war, neither giving in. What neither of them expected, though, was Pac's sheer determination. With all his strength, he yanked the blanket, pulling Jade up with it. In the process, they both lost balance, and Pac ended up falling onto Jade, right on top of her. The suddenness of the situation caught Kung completely off guard. For a moment, they lay there in stunned silence, unable to react. Jade stared into her husband's eyes for a brief moment, her face flushing with embarrassment, before she quickly turned her gaze away, feeling a mix of awkwardness and confusion. Pac, on the other hand, snapped back into his senses almost instantly. With a deep breath, he stood up slowly, trying to regain his composure. Without missing a beat, he announced that Jade would go to the presidential office tomorrow to apply for a position as a sign language interpreter. With that, he left the room, leaving Jade in a whirlwind of emotions and uncertainty. Over the past 3 years of their marriage, Jade and Pac had only shared the title of husband and wife, but not the intimacy of a real relationship. After the brief moment of physical closeness the night before, Jade found herself unable to sleep, her mind racing with emotions. The warmth of the encounter lingered, and she felt a fluttering sensation in her chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time. The next day, Pac and his team carefully reviewed all the recordings of the kidnappers' phone calls, but they couldn't find any leads. Just as they were about to give up, one of Pac's subordinates noticed something odd. The security footage from the day of the incident showed the kidnapper in Jade's car without any resistance, almost as if he had been expected or allowed to get in. Pac, troubled by this, consulted a friend for advice. His friend, an insightful strategist, immediately deduced that the situation was too clear to ignore. He suggested that Jade might have been involved in an affair, which would explain the ease with which the kidnapper gained access to her car. Later that evening, at Jane called the Tim, this time with an even more urgent tone. Pac, however, waited a few moments before answering. He couldn't understand why the kidnapper was in such a rush, so he decided to punish the caller by waiting 5 more minutes before responding. After he abruptly ended the call, Jade, with her fiery temper, immediately called back, over and over again. Each time, Pac ignored the calls, until suddenly, a loud explosion rang out in the vicinity. Jade froze, disoriented by the blast. As she regained her senses, she tried calling Pac again, but this time his phone went straight to voicemail. Her heart sank, and she felt an overwhelming sense of dread creep over her. Something was terribly wrong. Jade immediately rushed home, desperately searching for her husband. She combed through every corner of the house, but Pac was nowhere to be found. Exhausted and anxious, she curled up on the couch, waiting for the morning to come. The next day, the news broadcast began to air startling reports. At 10 p.m., the previous night, the president's spokesperson's office had been targeted in a terrorist attack. 6 people were reported injured, all of whom members of the office's internal staff. The news also revealed a recording of the terrorists' threat, Jade's own extortion call to Pac. To her shock and confusion, Jade realized that her call had somehow been twisted into a terrorist threat. In an instant, everything had spiraled out of control. What started as a personal act of revenge had now escalated into something much darker. Pac was caught in the middle of it, and Jade felt an overwhelming sense of helplessness and fear. At that moment, Pac returned home, his presence commanding as he swiftly lifted Jade and placed her on the dining table. His expression was serious, his tone unyielding as he spoke it. "There's a key piece of evidence, and it's right here with you," he said, his eyes fixed on Jade. "To solve this mystery, I need your cooperation." Jade, still reeling from the events that had unfolded, stared at her husband, a mixture of confusion and trepidation clouding her thoughts. What was he talking about? How could she possibly help him when everything seemed so tangled and out of control? Pac's grip on the situation was unsettling, and Jade could tell he wasn't going to let this go easily. There was something more at play, and she had no choice but to brace herself for whatever came next. In the side story from 3 years ago, on the night before the wedding, Yan confronted Pac with a chilling threat. She demanded that they call off the wedding the following day, or she would expose a deeply buried family secret. However, Pac wasn't focused on the threat. His mind was consumed by one question. Was the Jade family truly planning to marry Jade off to a jerk, a rich second-generation heir in an arranged union? Upon receiving confirmation, Pac made a decisive move. He insisted that the bride to be changed to his sister-in-law Jade. In that moment, his actions not only changed the course of his own life, but also set off a chain of events that would shape the lives of everyone involved. Pac had just survived the aftermath of a terrifying explosion, yet he wasted no time hurrying home. The urgency in his actions was clear as he carried his wife, Jade, and placed her on the bedroom bed. His intense gaze betrayed his inner turmoil as he fired off questions, demanding to know if Jade recognized the kidnappers or if there was anything, or anyone, she suspected. When Jade denied anything, Pak's frustration boiled over. If you don't know them, then why does that person know everything about me, even down to the most private details? Oh, he spat, pacing the room. In truth, Pak was consumed by doubt. He feared there might actually be a birthmark on Jade's leg, which could confirm the kidnappers' claims. Jade, on the other hand, felt equally cornered. She knew that if the situation escalated any further, it could spiral out of control, making it impossible to explain herself, no matter how innocent she was. Summoning her courage, Jade turned the interrogation back on her husband. Pak, what are you even trying to do right now? How much does that person really know about you? I've been through a bizarre kidnapping ordeal, and you're injured from an attack. But instead of focusing on the real danger, you're interrogating me like this. What are you trying to prove? The tension in the room was palpable, the weight of unspoken fears and unresolved doubts and thick between them. At this moment, a subordinate called, and Jade managed to get by temporarily. Meanwhile, the subordinate discovered that over the past 6 months, the police had received multiple reports of arson. Upon hearing this, Pak concluded that either the kidnapper had planned everything in advance and used the arson cases to cover up the real crime, or it was just a coincidence. However, one thing was certain. During the explosion, he was on the phone with the kidnapper, which raised suspicions of an accomplice. After all, with so much information in their hands, the culprit must be someone very close by. As for the threatening recording provided, Pak decided to tell the police identically. Coincidentally, all of this conversation was overheard by Jade, who was outside the study. Not long after, Pak walked out and Tiffy to stay to check if his wife's phone had been hacked. Although Jade felt uneasy, she still complied with his request. Unexpectedly, Pak, despite his harsh words, had a soft heart. While picking up broken glass shards on the floor, he grumbled about Jade's lack of professionalism, saying that even though she relied on her hands for work, she didn't take proper care of them. He then grabbed Jade's phone, declaring he needed to change clothes and head out immediately. This left Jade feeling particularly helpless. Meanwhile, the kidnapper received a text message from someone codenamed Teacher, forbidding him from acting on his side. Pak found nothing suspicious on his wife's phone, except for a single chat application. Suddenly, he recalled Jade mentioning her familiarity with a certain senior colleague, which sparked his jealousy. He opened the chat history between Jade and this senior, meticulously reading each message. Then something caught his attention. The senior, Shaw, had once taught at an orphanage. In addition, Shaw had arranged to have dinner with Jade this afternoon. Naturally, Pak couldn't feel at ease. He grabbed his phone and called a friend. By the afternoon, Shaw and Jade had just sat down when their mutual friend, Lee, walked in. It's important to note that Lee referred to Shaw as teacher. After a brief exchange of greetings, Lee shyly explained that she had also arranged to meet someone for dinner at the same place. She walked quite a distance before suddenly remembering something. Turning back, she reminded her two friends not to stare too obviously when the person she was meeting arrived. Shaw and Jade cheerfully agreed. However, it wasn't long before Pak walked in. The moment Jade saw that Lee's date was her husband, she nearly choked. She quickly turned her head, silently praying that they'd recognize her. And so, the date smoothly transformed into a 4-person dinner gathering. During dinner, Shaw thoughtfully cut up the fish fillet for Jade and placed it in front of her. Seeing his wife's delight expressing, Pak's jealousy was through the roof. Pak casually asked Jade if she liked fish, but Shaw jumped in to answer. In an instant, the atmosphere at the table turned tense. Pak, being the presidential spokesperson, knew he couldn't afford to lose his composure in front of his wife and their friends. He took the initiative to apologize to. However, Shaw, an experienced negotiator, cheekily remarked that it was thanks to Jade that he had the honor of dining with the spokesperson. After saying this, he reached for the wine bottle, intending to pour a glass for Pak. To everyone's surprise, Pak, acting like a child, flipped his wine glass upside down on the table, declaring that drinking all during the day was not allowed. Worried that the situation would become awkward, Jade quickly asked Shaw to pour her a glass instead. Seizing the opportunity, Shaw used sign language to chat with Jade, subtly interrogating her like he was conducting a background check. Shaw was so overwhelmed by the questioning that he completely lost his appetite. However, the drama didn't end there. Pak continued to press Shaw, asking if he was married. Shaw, not one to back down, cheekily hit that Pak might be interested in him. Jade, fed up with their childish behavior, deliberately knocked over her glass to put an end to their antics. She then used sign language to express her desire to go to the restroom and signaled furiously for Pak to follow her. Pak saw her signals but deliberately ignored them. Worried their marital relationship would be exposed, Jade had no choice but to leave on her own. At that moment, Pak's phone rang. Call from a subordinate. He stepped away to take it in private. After finishing the call, he turned around to find Jade standing right behind him. She snatched his phone and demanded to know how he found out about her dinner plans. Did you use the excuse of checking my to monitor me in real time? Or are you suspicious that I'm having an affair with my senior? She accused. Pak angrily took back his phone, retorting, you know Shaw as well as you think you do. And as for what kind of relationship you two have, I couldn't care less. He's nothing more than a thug who suddenly appeared in your life. But then, Pak's tone shifted as he asked. That said, how well do you know me? We've been together for almost 20 years now, haven't we? Jade was stunned by his question, unsure of what he was trying to convey. The dinner gathering ultimately ended on a sour note, leaving everyone in awkward silence. After returning to his office, Pak immediately ordered his subordinates to investigate Shaw. To his surprise, not only did his subordinates know Shaw, but one of them turned out to be a die-hard fan. It turned out that Shaw was incredibly popular on YouTube, especially among women. Hearing this, Pak's face darkened visibly. Mistaking his reaction for curiosity, the subordinate enthusiastically opened one of Shaw's fitness videos, showering the idol with praise. Look at this guy's physique. It's practically a work of art, especially his trapezius muscles on his back. Amazing. Pak shot his subordinate a withering glare, his jealousy written all over his face. At night, just as Jade was about to make a threatening call to Pak, she was caught off guard when he unexpectedly returned on early. Quickly thinking on her feet, she lied, saying she needed to go downstairs to buy something. Pak, curious, asked her what she intended to buy, and after confirming, volunteered to step out and get it himself. Taking advantage of the moment, Jade immediately dialed her husband's phone. Pak, however, intentionally walked to corner of sight of the house before answering the call. He couldn't understand why the supposed kidnapper kept demanding that he divorce his wife. What benefit could possibly come that? Jade, on the other hand, was growing desperate. How could he insist on clinging to a loveless marriage? But the more adamant Jade seemed, the more suspicious Pak became. He warned the kidnapper that he would never comply with such demands and that this conversation had to end immediately. He still had to get the items Jade requested. With that, he hung up the call. Not long after, Pak returned to the purchases. While removing his coat, he firmly declared, I will never divorce my wife. Then, as if to clarify, he added, I'm being upfront about this to prevent any misunderstanding. After all, the reputation and status of the Pak family cashed by outsiders, Jade was left utterly speechless. Before she could even process what was happening, Pak had already barged into her room. After chasing into the room, Jade found that the guy had already laid down on the bed. He then gave a command like Orfatei had lie down next to him. Naturally, Jade refused, but Pak simply turned off the bedroom lights. Pak said, if you don't have the confidence, then don't come in. This challenge worked as expected. Jade, fuming with anger, grabbed the pillow and lay down beside Pak. However, instead of getting angry, Pak lay down on his arm, using it as a pillow. In truth, he did this because he was worried the kidnappers might harm his wife. After all, if they could find the office, they could the house too. He felt that by lying beside Jade, his wife would be able to sleep peacefully. Pak also hoped that Jade could forget about the kidnapping incident, and of course, forget the phone call about the body once it appeared. With that, Jade slowly drifted off to sleep. Seeing this, Pak silently left the room. It turned out that when Jade was young, due to an accident, her younger brother died, but she survived. As a result, her mother, in order to continue receiving financial support from her third husband, ordered her young daughter to pretend to be mute to the rest of her life, like the Little Mermaid, turning into foam until the end. The next morning, Jade received a video call from her father. However, when she answered, she realized it was the kidnapper on the other end. The kidnapper not only knew that Jade had taken the special phone, but he was also aware that she had been making threatening calls to Pak. He was particularly pleased with this, as at least their goals were aligned. Therefore, the kidnapper warned her to continue making the calls, threatening that if she tried to escape halfway, he wouldn't hesitate to turn hostile. Seeing the teeth the kidnapper was holding, Jade instantly burst into tears. She quickly ran to the nursing home, relieved to find that her father had not been seriously harmed and that those teeth weren't his. Since her father had reported the incident to the police, they needed to go to the station for further investigation. On the way to the police station, the car's radio suddenly caused a loud, chaotic sound. This immediately reminded Jade of her own abduction. She had just been relieved, thinking her father hadn't been harmed, but now the situation made her feel nauseous with anxiety. The officers had to pull over, and while Jade was throwing up, she unexpectedly let out a sound of despair. She reflected on her life, feeling it was full of sorrow, threatened by her mother when she was young, insulted as she grew up, and now living in constant fear. She couldn't help but wonder if anyone she met along the way ever truly stood by her side. At that moment, Paek arrived with an escort of 3 police cars, parking confidently beside them. He then quickly walked up to Jade and assured her that he would personally take the individual to the police station. In front of the 2 officers, Paek admitted that he and Jade were married, but due to his special position, he requested that their relationship be kept confidential. As a token of gratitude, he promised to visit the police station later to express his thanks. Paek angrily got into the car, but to his surprise, the kidnapper had the audacity to manipulate his father-in-law. Aunt Daukat broke down and began crying uncontrollably. Paek, both surprised and pleased, handed her a handkerchief, softly muttering that crying like this was unattractive. He quickly clarified that he wasn't making fun of her, but rather encouraging her to cry freely if that's what she needed. Before long, packed the car to a luxury hotel and reminded Jade, "You didn't forget what day it is, did you?" Entering hotel room, Paek wanted to have a talk with Jade, considering all that had happened recently, starting from the kidnapping to the nearby nursing home. Although he hadn't requested the police to investigate, Paek warned that if things continued like this, an investigation was inevitable. He needed Jade to understand that if the couple, the police would begin by thoroughly investigating him. If there were any secrets, now would be the time to confess, as is not too late. Jade remained silent, and Paek noticed that she didn't seem willing to speak. He emphasized that he wouldn't force her to open up, since they had never interfered in each other's personal matters. Just then, the doorbell rang. It was the hotel service Paek had called before entering the room. Knowing that Jade hadn't eaten much that afternoon, he had arranged for some pastries and fruit to be brought to the room. In reality, today was the Paek's family gathering day. That fearing that Jade was too exhausted, Paek had already gone ahead to the restaurant. Paek's dad called his son over for a different reason. He wanted to use his son's position to boost his own popularity and to send out your votes in the upcoming election. Not long after, Jade arrived at the restaurant. She had just sat down, not yet touching the food, when Paek's dad started criticizing her. He compared their family to others, pointing out how other people's sons and daughters-in-law would attend events together, even bringing their pets along to rally votes. But when it came to his family, only his son was considered worthy to be in the spotlight. He went on to belittle Jade, saying her father-in-law did believe he could win the election, so he had to marry off his flawed second daughter. What good is a mute? Even a cheap, unwanted product has to know how to keep its own bowl full. A useless person who can't do anything, he sneered. Hearing this, Paek stood up in anger. To his surprise, he called over the manager in charge and took a digital camera from Mendra's hands. Before entering the restaurant, Paek had noticed someone hiding in the corner, taking pictures of them. He suspected the mastermind behind this was none other than his father, who was trying to use his son to garner votes for the upcoming election. Paek warned his father to stop thinking about manipulating him. Enraged, Paek's dad grabbed his son's shirt collar and threatened to leave his protection, claiming his son was nothing without it. Paek quickly thought it through and, for the first time, wondered if the kidnapper might have been sent by his father. After all, Paek's dad would stop at nothing to make his son submit to him. Paek reminded his father that he was able to climb his way to the door of the presidential office thanks to his grandfather's blessing, but how he made it across that threshold, Paek would figure out himself. He made it clear that he wouldn't be used as a stepping stone by his father. With that, Paek took Jade and left the private room. In the elevator back to their room, Paek tightly held his wife's hand. He hoped she could understand that being pulled in this situation to replace the missing sister was inevitable. He told her that when dealing with his in-laws' endless nonsense, there was no way to respond. These people, who would discard their children when needed, didn't deserve any attention. Whatever was said or done, he advised her not to listen, and definitely not to take it to heart. The next day, Paek's subordinates discovered that Shaw had uploaded several videos related to arson and explosions, demonstrated deep knowledge of these types of crimes. Furthermore, Shaw was currently hosting a crime-themed show. In the afternoon, the selection process for the president's sign-language interpreter officially began. Jade's performance stood out, as she started translating the video before the characters even spoke, which puzzled Paek. He personally visited the interview site and asked Jade to answer honestly whether she had seen the interview script beforehand, and why her sign language came before the audio. Jade explained that the footage shown earlier was a practice video. In order to ensure fairness, Paek asked Jade to translate a new video, which she managed to do flawlessly. Jade, frustrated, confessed that she had been practicing obsessively because of her admiration for Paek. Her ultimate dream was to become a sign language interpreter for related institutions. Now, she was able to observe where Pak spoke, meaning she could predict what he would say just by watching him. Suddenly, Pak changed his tone and questioned whether Jade truly couldn't speak. One of his subordinates misunderstood the question and suggested that Jade's condition didn't disqualify her from the position. They added that the job of a translator was to convey spoken words through hand movements, which is why Jade was given this opportunity. After leaving the interview site, Pak was trembling with anger. He couldn't understand how long his wife planned to keep pretending. Moreover, he finally grasped why Jade had been so confident, even claiming that she would outperform all the other candidates. The realization that Jade had been hiding so much from him, then feeling betrayed and confused. The day after Sky News celebrated its anniversary, as the youngest daughter of Jade's family, Jade was stopped by her mother before she could attend. Her mother forcefully pushed her into a side room, angrily questioning why Jade's father had been moved to a different nursing home. She demanded an explanation, threatening not to pay if Jade didn't notify her beforehand. Without giving Jade a chance to explain, her mother yanked off her shawl, crudely commenting that she would attract more attention without it. Just then, two women were gossiping in front of the mirror. They assumed that Yan was Pak's wife and couldn't believe she would attend the event. Instead, it was the gloomy younger sister, Jade, who showed up. As they talked about Jade, one of them began to feel uneasy, and the other quickly agreed. Jade over every word, they said, taking in every bit of the conversation. As Jade stood at the edge of the rooftop, fueled by the alcohol, she dialed Pak's number using the special phone. Her thoughts grew heavier, wondering what was so great about being a gloomy, socially awkward wife who seemed like just an add-on to her sister. To her surprise, Pak criticized the kidnapper for having a narrow view. He pointed out that Jade wasn't gloomy, but rather skilled at observing her surroundings. She wasn't bad at socializing, it was just that others often treated her poorly first. Her willingness to marry in place of her sister was, in fact, a reflection of her love for her mother. Pak made it clear to the kidnapper that Jade was an entirely new presence, a person of her own. Extra scene when Pak thanked the officers that day. He unexpectedly came across a piece of surveillance footage. The scared was shouting for help. This meant that Pak had known all along that his wife could speak.